Hiya 10. Right, I'm going to talk through some problems with water pollution. Okay, so yesterday we talked about the idea that the fact that there's more people, there's a bigger human population now, then we're having more of an impact on the environment. Okay, so yesterday we talked about land pollution, and today I'm going to talk about water pollution. Okay, so quite often in terms of the waste that we produce, we use rivers and oceans to try and help get rid of it. Okay, but obviously that can have an impact on the creatures that live there. Okay, so a lot of substances are dumped actually out at sea, okay, and that includes things like sewage. Sometimes sewage is just piped directly out into the sea. Sometimes oil will get spilled from ships, like tankers, or from where it's being drilled. Okay, so there's quite often spillages of oil. It could be chemicals, it could be other fuels, plastics. I think that's one that's often on the news at the moment in terms of plastics that's being deposited in the ocean. Okay, and then from disused ships as well. So anything that sinks or is just let to drift away. Okay, then obviously that can have an impact on the living things in the oceans. Okay, also on land, things get washed into sort of streams and rivers and more water sources on land. Okay, so little ditches and things like that. So farming and agriculture uses pesticides, like we talked about yesterday, to help kill any insects that are eating the crops. Fertilizers are put onto crops to help them grow better, but all of those chemicals can end up being washed off the crops and through the soil and then into our streams and then into our rivers, and then eventually all those rivers end up in the oceans as well. Okay, so we also have an impact in terms of water. Not just thinking about big bits of litter and shopping trolleys, we're thinking about things that could be dissolved in the water too. Okay, so one thing that can cause a problem, particularly fertilizers, but also sewage has a similar effect. Okay, now fertilizers are designed for putting on the crops to help them grow. Okay, however, fertilizers don't know what plant it is that they're helping to grow. They'll help any plant grow, and that can cause a problem if they end up washed into rivers and lakes, etc. Okay, so basically what happens is that those nutrients, fertilizers contain phosphates and nitrates rather, to help plants grow, and they can cause this process called eutrophication in streams and lakes, and that's because they are causing plants to grow. Okay, which is kind of what they're designed for, but it happens in the wrong place. So what happens is that the nutrients will build up in the water. That causes the plants in the water, particularly algae, to grow excessively. Okay, and what that does is that when those plants die, bacteria will break them down, but because the bacteria are living things, they will need oxygen. Okay, and because they're using so much of the oxygen to break down all these plants that have been growing out of control, then there's no oxygen left for the other creatures that are living there. Okay, so I've got a little animation that will hopefully work to just talk through this idea of eutrophication. So we've got our lake here, we've got our crops that have been sprayed or they've had fertiliser put onto them. That runoff goes into the lake. What will happen is that the nitrates and the phosphates, the algae will grow. Now you can see the plants. It can also be microscopic, that will make the water go very, very green. Okay, so we've got this excess growth now of the plants. That's going to block out the light as well, okay, and it will cause the plants lower down to die. Okay, once you've got that rotting material inside the water, okay, you've got this dead plant material, it gets broken down by the bacteria. So at the moment my fish are quite happy, my fish are fine. However, once that algae is being broken down by the bacteria, it's going to reduce the amount of oxygen that's there for the fish, and that's when the fish will start to die. Okay, so ultimately you've got all this algae. Okay, it's blocking out the light, it's causing other plant material to die. That plant material is getting broken down by bacteria, which uses the oxygen, so there's no oxygen left for the fish. Okay, so and it's not just big things like fish, it's also like little insects, etc. as well, which are food for other animals. So that's the process of eutrophication, okay, which is the wash out of fertilizers. Okay, so that's one idea. Now, This was briefly on the sheet in terms of how these chemicals can accumulate in food chains. Okay, we talked about food chains right at the beginning of the unit, and it's called bioaccumulation. They've called it biomagnification on this PowerPoint, but we usually refer to it as bioaccumulation. Okay, because these chemicals are accumulating within the food chain. Okay, and it can happen in the water, it can happen on land. Okay, it can happen in the ocean. But the idea is that these chemicals and these pollutants will build up in the food chain. Okay, so you've got some examples there. You've got DDT, mercury, PCBs. These are all chemicals that are used more often than not in agriculture. Mercury was one that was a big problem in Japan. Okay, so you've got these tiny levels, that's what these purple dots are representing. They've got low levels of these pollutants. Okay, and it's not at the moment having too much of an impact. Okay. However, what will happen is that these phytoplankton, these microscopic plants, will take up some of those chemicals into their bodies. Okay, and it won't break down. Right, so each tiny bit of plankton is taking in a tiny bit of that pollutant. Okay, the problem is, however, that other creatures then have to eat the small plankton. Okay, so zooplankton again are really, really tiny, but they're going to have to eat lots of phytoplankton, the plant plankton. Okay, so you've got the little brown ones, they've only got one purple dot in them, but you'll notice now because the zooplankton have had to eat a lot of them, they're getting a bigger dose, so they've got two purple dots in them. Okay, now hopefully you're getting the idea of what's going to happen. As you move up the food chain and the animals start to get bigger, they have to eat more food. Okay, so what's going to happen is that these fish, these small fish, will be eating lots of zooplankton, so they're going to get multiple doses of this pollutant, this chemical. So they've now got 5 doses of pollutant inside them. So the zooplankton might be they might not be healthy anymore, but they'll certainly survive. Okay, but my fish, it's starting to build up. Once you get to a medium-sized fish, they are eating lots of the small fish. So again, the dose that the small fish have got, if I just go back one, they've got 0.5 parts per million. So that's still quite a small dose. But because my medium fish eats lots of small fish, the dose is again building up. Okay, so you've got multiple doses inside this medium-sized fish, which is now a dose of 2 parts per million. Okay, it's still quite a small dose, but it can be it can have an impact. By the time you get to your big fish, which is going to eat lots of medium-sized fish, then you're going to have multiple doses. So this toxin, this pollution is accumulating within the food chain. Okay, so this fish has got lots of it. Now, so it's gone up to 25 parts per million. It might be that this fish isn't killed by the amount of pollution that's in its body. Okay, it might be that it doesn't make it very healthy, but it won't die. Sometimes they do, but if it doesn't die, now the problem that we've got is that humans go out fishing and we like to eat the big fish. Okay, so the problem that we've got is that quite often, although these may survive, it might have an impact on it, but if we then go fishing and catch these big fish and we eat them, then we are getting that big dose of pollutant in our diet. Okay, so it's accumulated as it's passed along the food chain because each organism gets bigger and bigger and bigger and they have to eat more food. Okay, now I'm not going to do that bit. I didn't realise that's what that was. Right, we can also look at what we call indicator species. Okay, so indicator species can give us an idea of the level of pollution within a particular habitat, within a particular water source. Okay, so in terms of a stream or a river, we can use these different species that live in water to estimate the amount of pollution that's there. Okay, so you've got here a sewage outlet. Okay, so it could be sewage, it could be a cattle farm, anything where there's going to be a high amount of organic material. Okay, so a lot of poop basically. In the same idea of this eutrophication that we had before. So you've got lots of nutrients that's going in. So if we assume that our sewage is put into the water at the beginning of the graph, what you'll notice is that all of a sudden the oxygen levels, because the bacteria are breaking down that sewage, the oxygen levels are going to drop. Okay, so this is going to mean that there's very, very low oxygen levels in the water. Now, as you travel further away from the source of the pollution, the source of the sewage, then it starts to improve, it starts to get better. Okay, so with the distance, you've got this drop in oxygen. Okay, and it gets to the very lowest point. It's still polluting a distance of river. It's not just at that point, it's polluting a distance of river. But then it starts to recover because it's getting diluted. Okay, so as the distance increases, then your oxygen is going to start going back up again. Okay, because the sewage is being diluted, it's being broken down already, so the oxygen level is starting to increase. And then it will level off once it gets back to normal. Okay, I know it's not quite normal, but that will then stay. That will be the base level of oxygen in the water. Okay, now different species prefer different amounts or can cope with different amounts of pollution. Okay, so we've got all our species here that are colour coded down the right hand side. So if you look at immediately after the sewage outfall, where the oxygen has gone down and you've got lots of pollution here, the sludge worm and the rat-tailed maggot don't mind having low oxygen. They don't mind that pollution. Okay, they actually quite like it. That's why their numbers suddenly go up. So where you've got pollution or high levels of pollution, you're going to have lots of sludge worms and rat-tailed maggots. Okay, so they are an indicator species. If you find those in a river, it suggests that you've got high levels of pollution. As the pollution starts to go down, then we get a change in the species. Okay, so now as we've gone further away from the sewage, the rat-tailed maggots start to go down. However, then the bloodworms start to increase. So bloodworms can tolerate a reasonably high, a medium amount of pollution. Okay, so the sludge worms and the rat-tailed maggots can cope with a lot of pollution. The bloodworms can cope with a medium amount of pollution. Okay, again, as you travel down the river, the bloodworms start to go down because the water's getting cleaner, it's getting better, it's starting to recover. Now you've got a third indicator species. So this time we've got water louse or water lice, plural. They start to increase. So water lice can actually tolerate a low level of pollution. Okay. Now there is always a crossover between these. It's not just like one disappears. There's always a crossover. But you'll find that there's some species that are dominant in different levels of pollution. Okay. Now what you'll notice is that the stonefly nymphs and often mayfly nymphs, they can only return once you get to a very low level of pollution. They really prefer very clean water. So once you're looking at here, where you've got a sort of medium amount and it's starting to recover, you might get a few stonefly nymphs, okay, but it's going to increase as the water gets cleaner. Okay, so now the water, we're a long way from the sewage outfall, the oxygen's returned, and our mayfly and our stonefly nymphs have increased. Okay, I've got no sludge worms, no rat-tailed maggots. They don't like clean water. They prefer living in really polluted water. Okay, so you can tell what the water is like by the species that live there. Now, just in terms of this, I'm going to show you how you can do that, how you can actually estimate and figure out, deduce where sewage is being released. Okay, so we've got a map here with the river. Okay, the river's the blue line that's running through it. We've got other bits coming on here, but we're just concentrating on this river here. And we've got 4 samples of water that have been taken, and we can see what organisms are in those samples. So it's using what we've got here. Okay, so you can always go backwards and forwards in the video. If I look at sample 1, I've got 5 stonefly nymphs and 1 freshwater louse. Okay, now the fact that I've got stonefly nymphs straight away tells me that that water must be quite clean. Okay, there must be a lot of oxygen in that water. Now, if I go to sample 2, I've got rat-tailed maggots. These are the rat-tailed maggots here. They actually have little tails. It's like a little snorkel that they breathe through. And I've got sludge worms. Okay, now if I go back up here, I know that my sludge worms and my rat tail maggots like polluted water. Okay, there's no stoneflies anymore. If I go to sample 3, I've got 1 rat tail maggot, but then I've got these bloodworms. Okay, so the water is starting to have less pollution in it. And if I go to sample 4, then I've only got 1 bloodworm, and I've got my freshwater lice, or my water lice, okay, which is this purple one here. So that shows me exactly where my sewage has been inputted into the river, okay, and that would be, it's very clean here with my stonefly nymphs, and then in sample 2 it's very, very dirty because I've got a complete change in the organisms that are living there. So I'm going to drag my cross, and somewhere between sample 1 and sample 2 is where my sewage has been released, okay, and then it's starting to improve as the sewage gets sort of broken down and diluted as you go down the river, okay. If we could continue down the river, it might be that we'd get animals again like we had in sample 1, okay. Now I've set a task on class charts which is reasonably similar to this graph, okay, so you need to be able to read the graph. You need to be careful if there's 2 different scales on it, okay. They still show the same sort of shape, so if it's high, then it's a high level of oxygen and a high population of the species, but just be careful of double axes, okay. And the task that you're going to do on class charts needs to be done on paper, and then you can send me a picture, okay.